Today I have for you one of the most historically significant chess masterpieces of all time, featuring a sacrificial attack played by Garry Kasparov that is absolutely mind-boggling, especially when you consider that Kasparov himself said that he didn't calculate the winning sequence during the game, but just played it on instinct. Although after the game he did give some insane variations, which we are of course going to take a look at. So this game is from the 20th round of the 1990 World Championship, the last one Garry Kasparov played against Anatoly Karpov, and it carries a historical significance that I've never heard discussed, which is that it's the most decisive and brilliant game from the last match ever played among humans to determine the strongest chess player in existence. Let me explain. After this match, the chess world was divided, Kasparov had a falling out with FIDE, and all the top players didn't compete together again until after strong chess computers began to come on the scene. When Kasparov famously lost to IBM's supercomputer Deep Blue in 1997, that really marked the turning point, after which the strongest human player could no longer claim to be the strongest chess player in the known universe. So in a way, this game really marks the pinnacle of human chess ability, the culmination of everything that we humans were able to learn about chess on our own before computers were strong enough to make major contributions to our understanding of the game. But enough said, you're here to see some moves, so let's get right into it. Garry Kasparov, playing white, opens this round 20 World Championship game with e4. Anatoly Karpov responds e5, and we go right into a mainline Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5, attacking the knight, which is defending the e-pawn. Karpov plays a6, sticking to the main line, no Berlin defense with knight to f6, as we often see today, since back in these days it wasn't thought to be a very good opening for black. And in case anyone is wondering if white can win a pawn here with bishop takes c6, followed by knight takes e5, he can't, since queen to d4, attacking both the knight on e5 and the pawn on e4 would get the pawn back with the superior position for black, which is why the bishop is now dropped back to a4. Knight to f6 now from Karpov. We have castles, offering black the pawn on e4, which he will usually decline, since after white responds d4, he will have to give up his e-pawn if he knows what's good for him, since e takes d4 here would run him into big trouble after rook to e1, pinning his knight to the king. So Karpov instead continues with the main line, bishop to e7, blocking that sensitive file to his king, hence the move rook to e1, defending the e-pawn. b5 kicks the bishop back to b3, d6 defends the pawn on e5, relieving the knight on c6 of that duty, so that it can possibly jump to a5 and initiate a favorable knight for bishop trade, which is why Kasparov now plays c3, giving his bishop a retreating square, while supporting a pawn thrust to d4 very soon, achieving his ideal central pawn duo. Karpov castles, we have h3 from Kasparov, preventing any bishop to g4, which would attack and pin the knight on f3, a key defender of the d4 square. He wants maximum support for that d-pawn when it's pushed there. Bishop to b7 now from Karpov. It's a move which prepares to exert more pressure on the e4 pawn after the knight on c6 moves somewhere. Of course, one issue with putting the bishop on b7 is that white will sometimes shut down its diagonal with d4 followed by d5, as we'll soon see. d4 from Kasparov as planned, rook to e8 from Karpov, lining up another attacker on the e4 pawn, planning bishop to f8 next to start clearing that file. Now this rook move does give white the opportunity to force a repetition with the move knight to g5, if he wants it, attacking f7, to which black's only defense is to move his rook back to f8. Then if the knight goes back to f3, we're back where we started. So this is not the best thing to play with black if you want to win against the player who you think might want to draw. But of course Kasparov does not want to draw, Karpov knows it, and play continues knight b to d2. We have bishop to f8 and a4 from Kasparov, following one of Ben Feingold's rules before it even existed, which says always attack the pawn on b5 in the Ruy Lopez with the move a4. At least I think he said that. Maybe somebody can let me know in the comments. It could just be one of my rules. But it is usually a good idea to put pressure on that b-pawn, since in this opening, it's not usually going to be a good idea for black to capture on a4. In this case, the bishop recapture would pin the knight on c6 and threaten d5. That's not good for black. So Karpov continues h6. He doesn't want to worry about knight to g5 anymore, since there are variations where it could become an issue. No time to get into them here, but if you can envision bishop takes f7 followed by queen to b3, you might be able to imagine some scenarios where that's very good for white. Kasparov continues bishop to c2, knowing that e4 is going to need more protection after e takes d4, c takes d4, and knight to b4, hitting the bishop, as well as e4 with 3 pieces. Fortunately, there is a b1 square on every regulation chessboard to which the bishop now retreats, maintaining that necessary defense of e4. Now we have the thematic c5 from Karpov, challenging that stately pawn formation, to which Kasparov replies d5. It is the best move, shutting down this bishop's diagonal and maintaining his central pawn majority, although it has lost some of its dynamic potential as a result of this move d5, and has given black a 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side. And so this position is roughly equal. Knight to d7 from Karpov, it is the best move, giving black 2 nice looking prospects. The first is to play c4, followed by knight to c5, and then possibly plant a knight on d3, supported by another knight. The other is to play f5, destabilizing the white center, since if white plays e takes f5, he's going to lose his d-pawn. That would not be ideal. So what can white do about this? Well, to me it looks very difficult. I would probably try something like knight to f1, but for Kasparov, this is very easy, because he knows the top book move, and that is rook to a3. Yes, we are still in well-known territory. This move, rook to a3, had been played many times over the past 5 years by grandmasters like Anand, Ivanchuk, not to mention by Kasparov himself 4 years earlier against Karpov. Twice! In both these games, Karpov continued c4 and lost, even though c4 is probably the best move for black in this position. But let's talk about this move, rook to a3. It looks a bit odd until you realize that it's the only developing move white has that actually improves his position, giving this rook a lot of lateral potential, including doubling up on the e-file, which is what Kasparov does next. Karpov plays f5, which the engine says is inferior to c4, though understanding why was apparently well beyond human capability in 1990, since all the top players at that time pretty much continued with e takes f5 or rook a to e3 here, just accepting the breakdown of their central pawn structure in return for some nice piece activity. But pause the video and see if you can find the only move that Stockfish says gives white a significant advantage here. See if you're smarter than a 1990s grandmaster. Okay. If you said g4, then congratulations. You found the only good way to render black's move f takes e4 completely unplayable. Best is probably to play f4, but if black does try f takes e4 here, then after something like knight takes e4, knight takes d5, then white has g5, with a powerful kingside attack, which is coming just a bit too quickly for black to survive. Here's just one example of how it can go down. After c4, a move that would be good without this rook on a3, here it will fail to g takes h6, g takes h6, and knight f to g5, sacking a piece in order to get the rook to the deadly g3 square. And so after h takes g5, bishop takes g5, hitting the queen, queen to c7, and rook to g3, a discovered check is threatened, queen to h5 is on the cards, black is completely toast. So apparently the strength of this attack was either unknown or underappreciated back in the 1980s and 90s, when in this position, Garry Kasparov played rook a to e3, giving Karpov the chance to equalize with the move f takes e4, followed by knight takes d5, with tempo on the rook on e3. But he didn't play this. Instead, Karpov went for knight to f6, just increasing the central pressure, a move which would totally equalize if not for another counterintuitive engine move, rook 3 to e2. The point of which seems to be that after f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes d5 does not come with tempo on the rook on e3, which means white will have tactics based on the discovered attack on the rook on e8 once his knight on e4 moves. So fire up the engine and explore that line if you want to see some fireworks, But we need to press on with the move Kasparov plays now, which is knight to h2. Makes some sense. He's planning rook to g3 in response to f takes e4 and knight takes d5, lining up on the black king, pinning the g-pawn. So Karpov decides to break that potential pin right away with king to h8, but this is a bit overcautious. Better would have been something like queen to d7, just connecting the rooks, since rook to g3 isn't really all that dangerous until white's dark squared bishop's diagonal opens to h6, and that's not going to happen until the pawns are exchanged on e4. So black can just bide his time and improve the position, but after king to h8, Kasparov has a strong move, b3, planning to line up his bishop with the black king via this diagonal, whose h8 square is suddenly not looking so safe. But Karpov has a plan to deal with this bishop, which begins with b takes a4. It is the best move, drawing white's b-pawn away from the defense of c4, so that after b takes a4, Karpov can now blunder with the move c4. It looks reasonable to try to do something with his c-pawn, and it will end up pushing the c3, supported by a knight, attacking the bishop, which will be on b2, but as you'll see, this doesn't work out so well. Best here would have been rook to b8, preparing to target the bishop when it gets to b2 that way, and if it drops back to a1, there's this crazy engine line, which we're not going to get into, but long story short, white ends up with his queen on d3, threatening queen to h7 mate with the help of this bishop on b1, to which black can respond rook takes bishop. And so that is my half-assed explanation for why rook to b8 is the best move in the position. But Karpov plays his c4, we have bishop to b2, f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes d5, hitting the rook, which goes to g3, which is now looking pretty scary for black, and for good reason. You have the bishop pair and the rook on g3 all bearing down on black's rather lonely looking kingside, but Karpov is counting on the passed c-pawn to let him block one of these bishop's diagonals with either the move c3 or with knight to d3, depending on how white plays. Rook to e6 now from Karpov is probably the best try in his now losing position, providing some essential protection to h6 in view of knight to g4 with the threat to sacrifice on that square. And knight to g4 is the move Kasparov plays next, though at this point it's a mistake and actually throws away the win. Best was knight to f3, with the idea of sacking a knight on g5, where it can be replaced with a knight if captured, and even if it's not captured, queen to h5 is crushing with all kinds of devastating tactics in the air. But after Kasparov's move, knight to g4, Karpov need only play knight to d3, and he will be just fine. If you look at black's king position, it's not hard to see that this light squared diagonal is the most dangerous one, leading to these holes on g6 and h7. So giving the pawn back with knight to d3 is going to be totally worth eliminating white's dangerous light squared bishop. But Karpov instead chooses the blunderous queen to e8, going for pressure down the e-file, pinning the knight on e4, and so threatening c3 when knight takes c3 is no longer possible. But Kasparov strikes first with the beautiful tactical shot knight takes h6, which brings us to the position where Kasparov said that he didn't need to calculate. And to what extent that's really true, I don't know. I'm sure he looked at a few moves, but apparently he didn't have all the tactical details worked out and just felt intuitively that this sacrifice ought to be winning. And the explanation he gave was that he has 7 pieces which can potentially participate in the attack on black's king. Even the rook on e1 does get involved, as you're going to see, while black has relatively few defenders, with 4 of his pieces sitting over here on the queen side. And it's at this point that Kasparov went through some mind-blowing variations which proved his intuition to be correct, beginning with rook takes h6. This was not played in the game, but it is a key defensive try, and it's the only way to accept the sacrifice knight since the g-pawn is pinned. Kasparov now gives knight to d6 with a discovered attack on the black queen. If the queen moves to d7, then there's queen to g4, attacking the queen again, who must maintain her view of g7, or else white will have checkmate beginning with bishop takes g7 check, If black tries rook takes d6, defending the queen, then white can mate in 4 moves as follows. Queen to h5 check. Now if the rook goes to h6, you're just going to take because the g-pawn is pinned. And so king to g8 is followed by bishop to h7 check. And after king to h8, bishop to g6 discovered check, king to g8, then queen to h7 is mate. So the most reasonable try in this position is to exchange the queens with queen takes g4, but here Kasparov gives the incredible knight to f7 check, a beautiful intermezzo and white's only winning move. The point is, after king to g8, you have knight takes h6 with check and a fork, and so after g takes h6 and rook takes g4 check, the king can only go to f7 since all these other squares are attacked. But now comes bishop to g6 check. Now the king can only go back to g8 since the e-file was covered by the rook. Bishop to f5 with discovered check is next, again driving the king to f7. But now there's bishop to e6 check. Beautiful, forcing the king onto the e-file, which means that bishop takes d5 wins a piece since this is a discovered check. And after the king moves, bishop takes b7 grabs another piece, leaving black a whole rook and a pawn down, and white with an elementary win. So that's what happens in this position if queen to d7 is tried. So what about queen to h5? Well, here Kasparov gives the amazing rook to g5. How he finds this stuff, I'll never know. But the point is, if queen takes rook, then knight to f7 check wins the queen with the fork. So you really got to try queen takes d1, but again, there is this in-between move, knight to f7 check. And after black's only legal move, king to g8, white picks up the rook with knight takes h6 check. Can't be captured since the g-pawn is pinned. So king to h8 is the only legal move, and now white captures the queen with rook takes d1. And with his material advantage is easily winning. But this is not quite the end of the story. Kasparov mentions the move c3, attacking the bishop on b2 while blocking its diagonal, which means this g-pawn is no longer pinned. And so black is threatening to take out the knight on h6. But here white has a disgusting sequence, which made Kasparov practically giggle with delight when he showed it. And it goes like this. Knight to f7 check. King to g8 is the only move. And now bishop to g6. Unbelievable. Just offering that bishop on b2, which if captured will result in a forced mate in 2, beginning with rook to h5 and rook to h8, which black is powerless to stop. So he's got to address that with something like knight to f6, guarding h5, but then c3 falls and black's material deficit, as well as his still much inferior position, will lead to his demise. Okay, so let's look at one more option for black. In this position, we looked at queen to d7, we just looked at queen to h5. So what about just sacking the queen with queen takes e1? And then following queen takes e1 with rook takes knight on d6. This does give black a material advantage, with a rook and 2 knights for the queen. But his king is still in dire straits after the move given by Kasparov, queen to e4. Simply threatening checkmate on h7. The best try is to block the diagonal with knight to d3, but here comes queen to h4 check. Again, you can't block with the rook. Since this pawn is pinned, the queen will just take it. So you got to play king to g8, which brings us to a good quiz position. How would you finish off black here if you were playing white? Well, the dazzling finish now given by Kasparov is bishop takes g7. And after bishop takes g7, queen to g4 is going to win that pinned bishop with check, and then is going to pick up the bishop on b7. None of black's pieces can defend. The queen has d7 covered. The engine is suggesting king to f8 for black, with a mate in 16 moves for white. So just incredible to see everything working out so beautifully for white, as if by magic. But getting back to this position, right after white sacrificed the knight on h6, we've looked at Kasparov's analysis of rook takes h6, followed by knight takes d6. So now let's press on with the move played in the game, c3. Karpov is attacking the bishop on b2 and shutting down its diagonal, and that pawn on c3 is immune from capture due to the pin on the e4 knight. But Kasparov simply ignores this move and delivers another stunning tactical blow with knight to f5. He wants to play queen to g4 next. But if he plays it before moving his knight from h6, then black can actually get away with capturing there with rook takes h6. So he's preserving this knight, but he is leaving his b2 bishop on the chopping block. And it's a sacrifice that Karpov now accepts with c takes b2. He might as well, since there's nothing better. He's totally lost, but at least this way, Kasparov is going to have to play very precisely to prove it, which he does, starting with queen to g4, threatening all kinds of nastiness, hitting the pawn on g7 with 3 pieces, also threatening queen to h4, and after king to g8, there's knight to h6, exploiting the pin on the g-pawn. Even worse is the threat that Garry mentions, which is simply to play king to h2, planning knight to g5, sacking the rook on e1 for the threat of queen to h4 check, followed by queen to h7 mate. Of course, the point of putting the king on h2 is that so rook takes e1 does not come with check. So what to do as black? Knight to f6 almost seems to work, but white can simply remove that knight with knight takes f6, and even allow rook takes e1 with check in this variation, since after king to h2, black has no good defense against queen to h4, which will force mate. And of course, taking the knight on f6 runs into queen to g8 checkmate. So what Karpov tries in the game is bishop to c8, setting up a potential pin on that f5 knight, so that if Kasparov now goes for his king to h2, then black has rook to h6, and there's no knight takes rook unless you want to lose your queen. Only trouble is, Kasparov can simply alter his move order and begin with queen to h4 check, which is what he now plays. Now, if king to g8, there's king to h2 with knight to g5 next, and no good defense against mate on h7, which is why Karpov decides to block with rook to h6, to which Kasparov responds knight takes h6, and after g takes h6, he plays king to h2, still looking to sack that rook on e1 with something like knight takes d6, and following queen takes e1 with queen to d4 check, which will lead to mate. So Karpov centralizes his queen with queen to e5, watching over some key dark squares, preparing to meet knight takes d6 with queen takes d6, and then if queen to d4 check, he can block with knight to f6 defended by the queen. But Kasparov now has something equally devastating, which queen to e5 is powerless to stop, and that is knight to g5. This is a forced mate in 10. The queen is attacked, the h-pawn is pinned, and so may not capture the knight on g5, and if queen takes e1, then knight to f7 is checkmate. So you gotta move your queen. Karpov tries queen to f6, which the engine says gives white a forced mate in 8, with the move Kasparov plays next, rook to e8, pinning the bishop and threatening a gorgeous checkmate, which black has very few ways to prevent. Kasparov gives the move bishop to b7 as an example of a move which does not prevent the checkmate, which I now invite you to try to spot. It's white to play and mate in 2 moves, give it a go, but here it is, starting with queen takes h6. Again, the bishop is pinned and may not capture the queen. If king to g8, then queen to h7 is simply checkmate, and if queen takes h6, then knight to f7 is checkmate. Absolutely stunning. So Karpov, aware of this threat, in this position, played bishop to f5, blocking this deadly diagonal so that the queen sack will not force immediate mate, at which point the quickest win for white begins with the move knight to f7 check, which forces mate in 6. Work that one out on your own if you'd like, but Kasparov's move is equally decisive, albeit a little bit slower, and that is queen takes h6. This wins anyway, despite the fact that it doesn't force mate in 2, since after queen takes h6 and knight to f7 check, forking, Here, the black king does have the h7 square as a result of this move bishop to f5, blocking the diagonal. Of course, that bishop on f5 is promptly removed with bishop takes f5 check. Karpov blocks with the queen since it's his only legal move, at which point Kasparov plays a move which he called an unforgivable mistake. Bishop takes g6. It's still totally winning, he didn't spoil his masterpiece, but rook takes g6 would have been even quicker, with the threat of checkmate on the next move once the rook goes back from whence it came. When white's bishop and knight are working beautifully to cover all three of these squares. And black can only delay this checkmate by making desperate piece sacrifices. The engine is giving mate in 13, but after bishop takes g6, with check from Kasparov, king to g7, and rook takes a8, Karpov is completely finished. White is up too much material. If you try to promote the pawn, forcing bishop takes b1, removing defense from the knight so that you can grab it with the king, rook to f3 check is going to win back material. So what's tried is bishop to e7, but now comes rook to b8, kind of tying up the black knights, since if the knight on e4 moves, then the knight on b4 falls, and if the knight on b4 moves, then white can grab the pawn on b2, or even play bishop to e4 with discovered check, picking up the knight on d5. It's all winning. If black promotes the pawn here, then white can even afford to drop a piece after bishop takes b1 and king takes f7, since he still has 2 rooks and 2 extra pawns for black's 2 knights, which is more than sufficient to win. Karpov plays a5, and after bishop e4 discovered check, king takes f7, bishop takes d5 check, knight takes d5, and rook takes b2. Kasparov has 2 rooks and 2 extra pawns for the 2 minor pieces, and so Karpov, deciding he's had enough in this position, resigns the game. So a beautiful and fitting ending to the human struggle for dominance in a game which would soon be ruled by computers. In a way, I kind of miss those days. Chess used to have a mystique to it that it doesn't really have anymore. Nowadays you can fire up Stockfish and get to the truth pretty quickly in almost any position. But back in the day, you could read a chess book, which would explain why some moves were good in games you didn't play, but that's about all you had to work with, unless you had a strong player to help you analyze. But now we can consult a super grandmaster on our phone anytime we want. And I wouldn't really want to go back, but let me know what you think about it in the comments, and consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the content, and I will see you soon.